On a spring afternoon in 1911, a fire broke out in a Manhattan garment factory. Within minutes, 146 young workers, most of them immigrant women, were trapped behind locked doors, forced to make an impossible choice: to burn or to leap. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire would shock a city, ignite a movement, and forever change the meaning of workplace justice in America. New York City, March 25, 1911. The sun dipped behind the skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan, casting long shadows across Washington Square. Inside the Ash Building, on the corner of Green Street and Washington Place, the Triangle Shirtwaist factory hummed with the clatter of sewing machines. Rows upon rows of young women, most of them immigrants, many no older than 15, sat bent over fabric, their fingers raw from long hours of stitching fine cotton blouses. They worked. Not for dreams of wealth, but for survival. The wages were meager, the hours grueling. Yet for many, this was the chance to carve out a foothold in a new world. Clara, a 17-year-old who had come from Kiev only 2 years earlier, pressed her foot against the treadle, the machine rattling beneath her hands. She dreamed of sending money back to her mother, still in Ukraine, and perhaps one day becoming a teacher. Around her, girls spoke in a chorus of languages: Yiddish, Italian, Russian woven. Together in a fabric of shared struggle, they worked behind locked doors. The owners feared theft, feared union organizers slipping in unnoticed, feared loss of control. So the exits were chained, the stairwells narrowed, the windows sealed with grime. The air itself was dangerous. Loose fabric scraps littered the floor like kindling, and lint hung heavy in the air, clinging to clothing and skin. For years, labor activists had cried out about conditions like these, warning of catastrophe. But warnings alone were easy to ignore. The factory kept running, day after day, its profits climbing higher. Then shortly before 5 o'clock, flames licked through a pile of fabric scraps on the 8th floor. No one would ever know exactly how it started. A stray cigarette, perhaps, or a spark from a machine. But within seconds, the fire leapt upward, fed by the tinder of cotton, paper patterns, and oil-soaked floors. Workers shouted, panic tearing through the factory. On the 8th floor, men and women bolted for the stairway, but already the flames clawed at their heels. Those who reached the doors found them locked. Clara and others rushed toward windows, but the fire surged faster than feet could carry. Some stumbled onto the fire escape, a rickety iron skeleton clinging to the side of the building. It bent under their weight, then snapped, hurling bodies into the alley below. On the 9th floor, workers had no warning. There was no alarm, no fire drill, only smoke-rolling black clouds seeping under the doors. Some pressed themselves against windows, choking on soot. Others clutched one another, whispering prayers. For them, the choices were unthinkable: to burn inside the inferno or to leap into the void. Outside, one by one, figures appeared at the ledges, clinging desperately before releasing their grip. Passers beyond the streets below screamed as bodies rained from the sky, the sound of impact muffled only by the roar of fire. Across the street, people watched in horror. Fire engines arrived, but their ladders reached no higher than the 6th floor, 3 stories short. Their hoses sputtered, the streams of water falling uselessly against the wall of flame. A fireman, eyes red with tears, shouted up at the women at the windows, begging them not to jump. But what choice was there? Inside, Clara found herself trapped. She gripped the hand of her friend Rosa, their palms slick with sweat. They looked into each other's eyes, both knowing that escape was impossible. Together, they stepped toward the window, their final act one of defiance and dignity. They did not want to die, but they would not burn. By the time the flames were extinguished, 146 souls lay dead, mostly young women, their lives cut short in a storm of fire and smoke. Their bodies lined the sidewalks, covered with sheets, waiting for families to come and identify them. The city had never witnessed such horror. The fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory was not just an accident. It was the brutal climax of greed, negligence, and indifference. The doors had been locked. The escapes were weak. The workers had been treated not as human beings, but as disposable parts of a vast machine. And yet, as smoke still rose from the ashes, something began to shift. The city's grief curdled into rage. Crowds gathered at funerals. Marches filled the streets. Activists, union leaders, mothers and fathers together. They demanded that no life should ever again be traded for profit in such a way. The days after the fire were heavy with mourning. Coffins stretched in long lines down the streets, pulled by horse-drawn carriages. Families wept over remains so charred they were almost unrecognizable. In the immigrant neighborhoods of the Lower East Side, grief hung like a shroud. Mothers had sent their daughters to work in the factory each morning, never imagining they would not return. Fathers clenched their fists in silence, powerless to undo what had been done. The city demanded answers. How could this happen in modern New York? How could one of the greatest cities in the world allow its daughters to perish behind locked doors? The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were put on trial for manslaughter. The evidence was damning: the locked exits, the absence of fire drills, the lack of sprinklers despite years of warnings. Witnesses recounted the horror with trembling voices. Yet in the courtroom, the machinery of justice faltered. Blank and Harris, wealthy and well-connected, were acquitted. Their lawyers argued that it could not be proven that the owners had personally known the doors were locked at the moment of the fire. And so the men walked free, even collecting insurance money that far exceeded the paltry compensation paid to the victims' families. But while justice in the courtroom failed, justice in the streets was stirring. On April 5, 1911, more than 100,000 people marched silently through Manhattan in a funeral procession that stretched for blocks. Black banners rippled in the wind, and voices carried a single demand: change. From that demand, a new era of labor reform was born. Frances Perkins, a young social worker who had stood in Washington Square that day and watched the flames consume the factory, later called it the day the New Deal began. She would go on to become the first woman in U.S. history to serve in the presidential cabinet as Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt. Her mission, shaped by the memory of the Triangle Fire, was to ensure that the lives lost were not in vain. In the years that followed, sweeping reforms transformed the workplace. Fire codes were rewritten. Doors in factories were required to open outward, never again to be locked against the workers. Sprinkler systems became mandatory in tall buildings. The right of workers to unionize gained undeniable force. Across the country, the labor movement surged forward, fueled by the memory of the young women who had died for no crime other than trying to earn their daily bread. And yet, even as laws changed, the images endured: the factory windows choked with smoke, the girls clinging to ledges, the desperate leaps to the pavement below. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire seared itself into the conscience of a nation, a reminder of what happens when human life is measured only in profit. Clara's name was lost to history, as were so many of the others: immigrant daughters, sisters, wives, all woven into the story of America. Their individual voices may have been silenced, but their collective cry still echoes more than a century later. The fire was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. It forced a reckoning, a confrontation with the true cost of neglect and exploitation. The legacy of those 146 souls is not only the laws that protect workers today, but also the moral lesson etched into history: that progress bought with human sacrifice is no progress at all. As we reflect on that day in March 1911, we are reminded that every workplace safety measure, every labor right, every hard-won protection carries with it the weight of their memory. The Triangle Fire asks us to remember, to remain vigilant, and to never forget the lives lost in the flames of indifference, because the question still lingers, echoing across generations: how many lives must be consumed before we learn to value them? The flames of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory burned out in a single day, but their shadow has never faded, reminding us that every safety law, every worker's right, was written in the blood of those who never came home.